Hey guys, today I'm working on an Asus Q536fd laptop that has a bad power jack. This is the service that we provide for $69 parts and labor at PCRepairHelp.net. And this laptop came in with a loose power port. As you can see, I'm plugging it in here, and it's a very loose connection. You can wiggle it back and forth to make it work, but it just does not fit snug anymore. It should snap in there nicely and fit. So the power jack needs to be replaced, and this is one that's soldered directly onto the motherboard. And the first step is to remove the big bottom panel, and it has some screws that you need to remove, as you see I'm doing here. And once you remove those screws, you can remove the bottom panel to gain access to the motherboard and all the components. And now that I have all the screws removed, I'm going to take a guitar pick, and you can use any pry tool you're comfortable with. I prefer the guitar pick because it's nice and thin and goes in between the bottom chassis and the bottom cover really nicely. And you just go around that with the pick and just pry up on the bottom cover to remove it. So now that the bottom cover is removed, the first thing I like to do on any laptop, and this one is no different, is to remove the battery. You want to disconnect and remove the battery because you never know if it's on or something could happen where it comes on when you're working on the components internally. So I always prefer to have that battery, if I can, disconnected and removed first. So now that the battery is removed, I'm going to disconnect some of the ribbon cables from the motherboard. This is a flip-up style connector on most of them, where that little lock just flips up and flips back down to lock and unlock. And then here I'm detaching the speaker cable and the touchpad and the backlight and then the keyboard. And here I'm disconnecting the Wi-Fi leads. I just take a small flathead and just pop them up. They kind of pop up, pop back down. And this gives me access to remove or detach rather the fan connectors. And now I'm going to remove the screws of the fan and the heatsink so that whole heatsink fan assembly can come out. And here I'm just disconnecting another video cable. And this is the removal of the heatsink screws. So now this heatsink fan assembly can come out. And the next step here is to remove the hinge screws. The hinges are going over the motherboard, so the screws need to be removed so you can flip up the hinges and gain access to the motherboard. So now that all the hinge screws are out, I can kind of just open the laptop a little bit, and that's enough to get those hinges to come up so that I can use my thumbs to finish the job by pushing them all the way up. And now I'm removing the motherboard screws. And now the motherboard screws are removed, and I can remove the motherboard from the chassis. And now we can start the removal process of the broken power jack. As you can see, it's soldered directly to the motherboard, and it's going to need to have a proper desolder job and removal. Alright, so now I got the motherboard out, the soldering iron heated up to about 750 degrees, and I'm going to add some flux to each one of the solder points. My desoldering or removal process, I like to add some flux, add some solder, and then start to desolder with a desoldering braid. Adding the flux and adding the solder just helps break up that old existing solder in there and gets that solder flowing and ready for removal. Now, there's multiple ways you can do this. You can use a solder sucker, some kind of solder pump. I prefer the braid, but it's just personal preference. I use the pump sometimes too, depending on the application. But here I'm just going to add solder to each one of these points just to get it flowing. This typically makes the removal process much easier. And so now I have my desoldering braid, or wick as it's called. And I'm using a flathead style tip on that soldering iron. I find it, fits nicely in where the through holes are. You just kind of get a little wedge in between the through hole and the wick. And you just want to heat up that through hole and get that solder removed. And this is probably the most difficult part. Sometimes that solder just does not want to come out. You can redo the whole flux and solder adding process too. Sometimes I have to do that multiple times. And if I can't fully get all the solder out, sometimes I have to use the hot air station, which I'll be using in this video to remove the jack. But you obviously just want to go around to each through hole and just remove as much solder as possible. I'm sorry for the camera angle at times. It's hard to get the camera and my hands not in the way when I'm doing certain angles. But it's all the general same idea. I'm just holding that solder wick over that solder point. I'm just trying to get as much out of there as possible. And if this isn't something that you're comfortable with, or you don't have the proper tools or skills, this is a repair that I perform for $69 parts and labor on an Asus model like this one. I offer a nationwide mail-in repair service, or if you contact me, I can get in touch with you and go over the symptoms, see if it's something we can do, make sure your laptop is one of the ones I do for that $69 rate. But this Q536fd is one I do for that normal rate. And another part of the desoldering technique is just flipping the board over and going at that through hole with the wick and the soldering iron on the other side of it. And another note, you want to be really careful of the components around that jack. There's lots of resistors and capacitors and stuff like that that you want to be careful not to ding or damage when you're doing the desoldering process. And a lot of the solder has been removed, and here I'm just checking how loose that connection is now. Sometimes when you remove the solder, you can just kind of wiggle the jack free, just depending on how much solder you've removed or not. And that thing, once you've done the proper desoldering job, it should come out pretty easily. If it doesn't come out easily, then you don't want to yank on it or pull it out. You can damage the through hole doing that. And what I've decided to do here is just clean it up a little bit with some 99% alcohol. I'm actually going to put it underneath the hot air soldering station. Once you have removed a bunch of the solder, the hot air is pretty effective about getting that jack removed safely. It's all about not damaging the motherboard, obviously, when you do the removal. So a good option in this case is for me to use the air soldering station, and that'll heat those through holes up, and just that tiny amount of solder that's holding it into place will kind of fall out, and the jack will be removed. So I like to clean it up, and here I'm getting my capped on tape, which is that heat tape that will keep the components around the jack safe while I use the hot air on it. So here I'm putting that heat tape around those sensitive components, getting it prepped for that hot air station. If you don't have access to the hot air station, you can keep trying to do more desoldering. I could have done that in this case, but I do have access to a tool like that, so it's good to use it. It makes my life a lot easier. So I'm just covering that HDMI port and those resistors and capacitors around it. I'm just putting a piece of cardboard underneath that so it kind of gives me an extension, something stable for that thing to sit on. And now I have the hot air station about an inch and a half, couple inches above the jack roughly. And I'm just going to go around to each one of those through holes and just heat everything up. That motherboard will heat up this is kind of a thin motherboard, so depending on the thickness of the board, almost in my opinion it determines how long you need to leave the hot air on there and how much solder you've already removed. In this case there's not much solder left in there, so this is kind of like just finishing the job. But I'm just checking there with the tweezers, how loose the connection is. It'll basically just fall out when it's time, when it has enough heat on it for a long enough amount of time. So there it goes. Now the jack is removed and I can clean everything up and get ready to put a new one on there. And this is the old broken jack that was removed off of the board. If I can get it to focus. And so now here's the new port I'm going to install. And I'm just taking that plier there and just putting the little wire wick cutter rather, and putting it underneath there. One of the tricks to putting the new jack on is you want to make sure that jack is nice and level inside there. You don't want it dipping to one side or kind of recessing out of the motherboard when you're doing the soldering process. So you want to make sure that thing's all the way in there and nice and flush. And here I'm just removing the rest of that tape. And here I'm just making sure that thing is in there properly. The last thing you want to do is have to do another removal, getting that jack on there properly. And so now I'm going to add some fresh solder to those through holes with the new jack installed. You just want to make sure that solder is flowing all the way through the through hole. And again, I apologize for my hand being in the way here. And so now I'm just going to take some more of that 99% alcohol, clean up all the flux that's on the board, just making sure I get that thing nice and clean before I put it back together. And now the jack's installed and the laptop is ready to be put back together. Thank you so much for watching.